"You clueless little fraud." The words dripped off Donald Trump's tongue like venom, loud enough to slice through the marble-walled chamber. Cameras snapped to life. In that instant, the insult wasn't just aimed at Jasmine Crockett. It was aimed at every veteran in the gallery who had bled, served, and been forgotten. 27%. That's how much VA housing was slashed under Trump's watch. 13,000, the number of veterans left homeless in a single year. Trump smirked like the numbers didn't matter. But Jasmine's eyes didn't flinch. She knew something the nation didn't yet know. A truth buried in documents, in dates, in signatures. A truth that could take just 29 seconds to turn his smirk into silence. And in that chamber, under the glare of the committee lights, the countdown had already begun. The hearing chamber wasn't just quiet, it was listening. It was the kind of stillness that didn't simply wait for words but inhaled them before they were spoken. Every creak in the wood benches felt like a drumbeat. Every faint rustle of a jacket was a whisper of anticipation. The air was heavy with an unspoken truth. Something irreversible was about to happen. From the far door, Jasmine Crockett appeared. She didn't walk in, she advanced. Each step was deliberate, heels striking marble like the second hand of a clock that no one could stop. It wasn't just her entrance, it was her announcement. Trump's eyes flickered toward her, just for a breath. His smirk tightened, not gone but altered, like a poker player holding a weak hand and bluffing with teeth. He leaned back in his chair as though to project comfort, yet his fingers tapped once against the polished wood, betraying a current under the calm. The veterans in the gallery leaned forward almost in unison. Their medals caught stray glints from the overhead lights, a silent flash of steel in a room already tense. They didn't have to be told this was about them. They could feel it in their bones. A low hum from the press section murmured like the tide. Reporters ready to pounce on whatever the next few minutes might bring. Lenses shifted, microphones angled, and in the control rooms blocks away, producers were already cueing graphics for the chyron. Jasmine reached her seat at the witness table but didn't sit immediately. She took a slow moment to survey the space. The dais where the committee sat, the long table where Trump reclined, the arc of veterans lining the back wall. Her eyes moved with precision, cataloging every face, every stance, like a general marking troop positions before battle. Trump adjusted his tie, a gesture too calculated to be casual. His aides leaned in slightly from either side, murmuring into the space between them, their eyes darting from Jasmine to the envelope resting near her fingertips. That envelope, unremarkable in color, standard in size, seemed to pulse in the collective awareness of the room. No one knew exactly what it contained, but everyone felt it. Jasmine finally sat, the chair legs dragging softly across marble. She didn't look at Trump yet. Instead, she let her gaze drift past him, over his shoulder, as if her focus was on something larger than the man himself. Her hands folded gently atop the desk. Her breathing was steady, but her stillness carried an electric charge, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm. Trump broke the silence first. "Well," he said, voice dripping with that signature mix of mockery and self-satisfaction, "I'm glad you could finally join us." A couple of aides smirked. The press gallery tilted forward. The veterans didn't move. Jasmine blinked once, slow, and then met his eyes for the first time. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world, Mr. Trump." Her voice was calm, low, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. Something in the way she said it made the smirk on Trump's face tighten into something more rigid. It was a small shift, but to those who knew the game, it was a tell. In the second row, a man with a silver star pinned to his chest shifted his weight forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't smile, didn't frown, but his attention locked onto the space between Jasmine and Trump, as if waiting for a spark to hit tinder. Trump leaned back again, fingers drumming lightly on the table. It was a rhythm that might have been meant to look casual, but the speed of it, a hair too quick, betrayed a restless energy. The chairman cleared her throat, preparing to begin the official proceedings. But in truth, the hearing had already begun the moment Jasmine walked in. Every camera lens seemed to close in tighter. Jasmine's eyes dropped briefly to the envelope beside her. She didn't touch it, not yet. But that fractional glance, deliberate and fleeting, was enough to send a ripple through the gallery. Trump's gaze followed hers, and for a split second, the smirk faltered. Not much, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. The chairman's voice rang out, reading the formal opening statement. It barely registered with the room. Everyone was watching the two figures at the table. Trump exhaled sharply through his nose, leaning into the mic as if about to speak again. But Jasmine moved first. Her right hand slid, slowly, deliberately, toward the envelope, her fingertips brushing the edge. She didn't pick it up. She just let them rest there. The move was subtle, but in the hyper-aware atmosphere of the chamber, it landed like a gavel strike. A CNN producer whispered into a headset, "Stay on her hands, don't cut away." Jasmine looked up at Trump again. The connection between their eyes was unbroken, a live wire stretching across the table. And in that moment, with the cameras trained, the veterans leaning forward, the press waiting for any flicker, the next words spoken would decide how the story began for the rest of the nation. The countdown wasn't just underway anymore. It was almost at zero. Trump gave a small chuckle, shaking his head as if dismissing the tension. "Let's not waste time, Congresswoman," he said. "We both know you're here to make a scene." The insult hung in the air. Jasmine didn't blink. "Scenes," she said, her tone soft but unyielding, "are what we make when the truth has been ignored for too long." No one in the room moved. The hum of the lights felt louder. Outside the chamber, America was waiting. Inside, the fuse was already burning. Before the first exchange, the room was already a battlefield. Not of gunfire or grenades, but of posture, breath, and gaze. And on one side, Donald Trump, flanked by aides in dark suits, his chair pushed back at a calculated angle. He sat as if the furniture was built for him alone, chin tilted just high enough to force others to look up when speaking to him. His fingers drummed on the armrest in a steady rhythm, the kind that could mean confidence or concealment. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, still as stone, her hands folded loosely before her. But her stillness wasn't passive. It was a stance honed by people who have learned that movement can give away too much. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't fidget with her pen. Every part of her presence said, "I'm ready to go to war, but on my timing." Above them, the bright committee lights blazed. Not soft, not flattering, but harsh and clinical. The kind of light that forces every flaw into view. They didn't just illuminate, they interrogated. They burned down into the faces at the table, making sweat bead faster, shadows deepen sharper, and every twitch looked like a confession. Around the edges of the room, camera operators became predators. They shifted their angles like hunters adjusting their scope, hunting for that one frame. The flicker of doubt in Trump's eye, the razor edge in Jasmine's smirk. In the press gallery, reporters leaned forward with pens frozen an inch above their notepads, like coiled snakes waiting to strike ink. The marble floor gleamed beneath their feet, polished so perfectly it reflected light into the air, like a second, subtler interrogation. The scent of it, cold stone warmed under too many lights, mixed with the faint smell of paper, leather, and the cologne of power. It was the smell of hearings where careers are built or buried. Trump adjusted his tie again, slower this time. His aides mirrored his movements without realizing it, each one sitting forward just enough to signal loyalty, but not enough to steal focus from the man at the center. One of them leaned in to whisper, but Trump shook his head almost imperceptibly, eyes locked ahead. Jasmine watched all of this, the tie adjustment, the whisper, the head shake. The way a chess player watches an opponent's opening move. She didn't take notes. She stored it away, invisible ink on the walls of her mind. In the second row, the veterans sat in silent formation. Their faces were roadmaps of service, lines carved by years in desert heat or jungle damp, eyes weathered by things no camera had ever captured. Some wore ribbons so bright they almost hurt to look at under the white lights. Others had no visible insignia, but carried a different kind of badge, a jaw set tight, a spine that refused to bend. One man's prosthetic leg caught a stray beam from the overhead lamps, the polished metal winking like a signal. His arms were folded across his chest, but his eyes didn't blink, tracking the space between the two figures at the table. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. Not words, just the restless shifting of people who know they're about to witness something. Even the security at the doors adjusted their footing, their eyes flicking toward the table as if bracing for the unexpected. The chairman cleared her throat again, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. But even she couldn't strip away the fact that this wasn't her room to control anymore. This was no longer a committee hearing in the traditional sense. It had already morphed into a trial by public opinion, and the court was the entire nation. Trump leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table, the smirk returning to his lips like an old friend. "You ready for this, Congresswoman?" he asked, the words heavy with derision. The corners of Jasmine's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a snarl. "More than you," she replied, her tone soft enough to force everyone to lean in just a fraction to hear it. That small lean, the physical movement of an entire room toward one voice, was a kind of victory in itself. Trump's eyes narrowed, but his smirk stayed in place. His hands, however, stopped drumming. The aides noticed. The cameras noticed. Jasmine noticed. For a beat, no one spoke. The lights hummed. Somewhere, a pen clicked shut. Then the sound came. The faint scrape of a chair leg on marble as Jasmine adjusted her position, turning her shoulders slightly toward Trump. It was such a small shift, but it changed the geometry of the room. Suddenly, it wasn't a table between them. It was a line. On one side, a man who'd built a life out of branding power. On the other, a woman who understood that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who doesn't need to fill the silence. The audience didn't know what the first question would be, but they knew it wouldn't be polite. The marble walls seemed to lean in, as though eager to carry the echo of whatever came next. Somewhere in the back row, a veteran murmured just loud enough for his neighbor to hear, "Here it comes." And every camera in the room, every journalist, every spectator, every single eye, fixed itself on that narrow strip of space between Jasmine Crockett and Donald Trump, where the first strike of the war before words was about to land. In the minds of older Americans watching from living rooms, diners, and VFW halls across the country, the air in that hearing room seemed to warp, carrying them back 55 years. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something colder, memory sharpened into judgment. A younger Trump appeared in their minds, frozen in an image from an old New York Post-Society page. Tailored overcoat, scarf tucked just so, leaning against the brick facade of a Manhattan brownstone. His hair was darker then, his smile wider, and his hands, uncalloused, stuffed into coat pockets that had never known the weight of a rifle. In the background of that memory, other boys, same age, same height, stood in lines at draft offices, clutching manila envelopes that didn't hold property deeds or corporate contracts, but orders that could send them halfway around the world. Some of those boys would never come back. On a second screen in the press gallery, a yellowed clipping from 1968 flickered to life. "Bone spurs, medical exemption granted." The letters looked brittle, the kind of print that crumbles at the edges if you hold it too long. A smaller line beneath read, "Local physician signs off on Trump deferment." It wasn't evidence yet, not in the legal sense, but it was foreshadowing, and Jasmine let it hang there like a loaded revolver, resting on a table no one had touched. Yet. Trump didn't look at the screen. He kept his gaze locked forward, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a faint muscle movement that betrayed recognition. His aides exchanged quick glances, the silent language of political damage control. "We've been here before. We survived it before. Stay the course." But in the gallery, the veterans didn't move like they'd been here before. They sat straighter. A few adjusted their jackets, making their service ribbons catch the light like shards of glass. One man in the front row, his Marine Corps cap pulled low, shifted his weight forward, elbows on knees. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was measuring. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She let the images do the speaking for her. That was the trick, letting the silence become a pressure chamber. The hum of the committee lights grew louder in the ears of everyone watching, until it became a steady pulse. For those over 50 watching on television, the words "bone spurs" weren't abstract. They were part of a shared cultural code. They remembered the boys from their neighborhoods who left in uniforms, and returned in flag-draped coffins, or sometimes didn't return at all. In a bar in Ohio, an older man in an army jacket muttered at the screen, "I knew 3 guys, 3, who didn't get that letter." His buddy, a Vietnam vet with weathered hands, shook his head and sipped his beer without looking away. In a living room in Texas, a widow clutched a photo of her husband in uniform, her eyes locked on the television, watching the congresswoman's stillness like it was its own kind of weapon. Back in the chamber, Jasmine finally moved. Her fingertips brushed the envelope beside her, just lightly enough for the cameras to notice, just heavily enough for Trump to see it was intentional. He didn't turn his head, but his eyes flicked sideways for a fraction of a second. That was enough for the camera operators to catch it. CNN's feed director's voice crackled in someone's earpiece. "Tight shot. Stay on that envelope." She still didn't open it. Instead, she leaned back slightly, letting her gaze sweep the room, the committee members, the veterans, the press, before landing squarely back on Trump. There was a story in that look. It said, "I know where the bodies are buried, and I know whose name is on the shovel." The chairman cleared her throat again, reading into the record the standard procedural language. But no one in the room, not even the stenographer one, was listening. This was no longer about parliamentary order. This was about moral order. Jasmine tapped the envelope once, twice, then let her hand fall away. The sound was tiny, but it cut through the air like the crack of a cue ball at the start of a match. Trump adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture so practiced it was almost muscle memory. His smirk returned, but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. She glanced toward the gallery, her eyes landing on a man in the second row. Sergeant Daniel Reeves. His silver star gleamed in the light, his jaw set so tightly it looked carved from stone. His prosthetic leg was angled forward, the metal catching a flash like a warning. And in that tiny exchange, a congresswoman's glance and a war hero's silent nod. The chamber shifted again. The story was no longer about a letter from 1968. It was about everything that letter had stolen from men like him. Outside, Americans in their kitchens and living rooms leaned closer to their screens. They might not have known Jasmine personally, but they knew what they were seeing. Someone about to call history into the room and make it sit at the table. The stillness deepened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The phantom from 1968 was no longer a faint shadow. It was standing in the chamber now, invisible to the eye, but felt in the tightening of throats, the hardening of jaws. The way Trump's smirk didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. Jasmine reached for her microphone, not to speak yet, but to draw it closer, the sound of its metal base scraping softly across the desk. It was a small, deliberate prelude, like a conductor raising the baton. Whatever came next, the ghost had already been summoned, and this time, it wasn't leaving quietly. The way Jasmine placed it there, centered, angled just enough for the gallery to catch a glimpse, turned that envelope into a weapon, a warning. Her fingertips rested on it for a second too long. Then came the sound, a tap, once, twice. It was soft, but sharp, like the pop of a distant rifle that makes every soldier freeze. In the back of the room, a veteran's head tilted forward. He wasn't leaning to see better. He was leaning because his body understood that this moment mattered. The cameras tightened their focus. One lens operator whispered into his mic, "She's baiting him." Another voice replied through static, "Don't look away." Trump's eyes flickered to the envelope for half a heartbeat. His expression didn't change, but the glance was enough. And in a room like this, half a heartbeat was a confession. Every veteran in the gallery saw it, noticed it, filed it away. Trump turned back to his water glass, lifting it in that lazy, almost bored way he'd perfected over decades in front of cameras. He took a sip, swallowed, set it down a little harder than he meant to. The microphones caught the thud. Jasmine didn't react, didn't smile, didn't smirk. She simply shifted her chair a fraction closer to the table. The movement subtle but predatory, like a big cat closing the distance without breaking eye contact. The manila envelope stayed put, unmoved. But in every mind in the room, it loomed larger than the chandelier overhead. Trump's aides noticed. One leaned in, murmuring something behind his cupped hand. Trump brushed him off with a flick of his wrist. keeping his gaze locked somewhere just past Jasmine's shoulder, as if pretending she wasn't the center of the universe in that moment. But pretending is only as good as the audience you're fooling, and the veterans weren't fooled. In the second row, Sergeant Daniel Reeves adjusted his posture. The silver star on his jacket caught the light again, a flash so quick it could have been missed if you blinked. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, his gaze fixed squarely on that envelope, as though he could feel its weight from where he sat. Jasmine let the silence stretch, and in that silence the envelope became more than paper and glue. It became a loaded chamber. No one knew what was inside, but everyone was certain of one thing. If she opened it, the blast radius wouldn't be confined to that room. It would ripple outward, into headlines, into households, into history. The chairman shifted in her seat, glancing at the clock before turning her eyes back to the table. She could feel it too. The coiling tension, the way the air seemed thicker around that beige rectangle. Trump leaned back, folding his hands. "You think you've got something," he said, voice low, measured, "but you've got nothing." It was a calculated line, designed to undercut. But his delivery betrayed the faintest edge, the kind that comes when you're speaking as much to yourself as to the person across from you. Jasmine didn't blink. "We'll let the record decide that," she replied, the words almost casual. Almost. In the press gallery, pens scratched furiously. Laptops clicked. A correspondent mouthed the words, "This is it," to the producer seated beside her. CNN's control room director's voice came through the comms. "We're staying on the table. No cuts. If she moves that envelope, I want the tightest shot we've got." The envelope didn't move, but the tension around it swelled like a storm cloud. A Fox News cameraman adjusted his angle, catching Trump's fingers, tightening just slightly against each other. The man was still smirking, but the muscles in his jaw had begun to work. Slow, deliberate movements of someone holding back words they didn't want to say. Jasmine finally leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and spoke in a tone so measured it seemed to slow the air. "Sometimes, Mr. Trump," she said, "the smallest thing in the room carries the most weight." Her eyes flicked down, just briefly, to the envelope. The veterans in the gallery were statues now. Even the hum of the lights seemed muted, as though the room itself was straining to hear what might come next. Trump shifted in his seat. His tie fell slightly askew, and he straightened it, but too quickly. It was a defensive motion, a tell he'd never admit to. Jasmine lifted her hand from the envelope, letting it hover for a moment before pulling back. She wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. In that choice, the decision to hold back, she told the room she was in control of the tempo. She was the one deciding when the shot would be fired. And that, perhaps, was more dangerous to Trump than the envelope's contents themselves. Because in politics, as in war, the side that controls the pace controls the field. Trump's eyes darted to the envelope one last time before he forced them upward, locking back on Jasmine. "Let's get on with it," he said, the words clipped, impatient. Jasmine smiled, just barely. "We are," she said, and the envelope stayed where it was, still closed, still silent, still holding the power to kill a legacy with a single tear across its seal. No flourish, no accusation, just fact. Donald J. Trump, Selective Service Number. Her voice was steady, almost clinical, the way a surgeon speaks before making the first incision. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at the official document in her hand, its edges worn from decades of existence, its black typewritten letters stubborn against time. She turned a page with deliberate slowness, and the sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it had any right to be. 1968. The year hung in the air like a single toll of a funeral bell. Somewhere in the gallery, a veteran exhaled through his nose. 1969. A pause. The press gallery leaned forward as if they could catch the meaning in the spaces between words. 1970. Trump sat back, his arms folded now. His smirk was still there, but it was brittle, like glass under a boot. His eyes flicked toward the cameras, but the cameras weren't saving him. They were recording every blink, every micro-expression, every tightening of his jaw. 1971. A whisper passed between two veterans in the back row. Not gossip, not idle chatter, just the low, heavy agreement of men who recognized the pattern. 1972, 5 deferments. She didn't have to say the number. It was written in the rhythm of her voice, in the weight of the silence that followed. Each year was a hammer blow. Each pause, another reminder. This wasn't political theater. This was the slow, methodical stripping away of armor. Jasmine lowered the page to the desk, letting it rest there like a piece of evidence in a trial. Her gaze lifted, not hurried, not hesitant, until it locked with Trump's. 5 chances to serve your country, she said softly. 5 chances to stand beside the men and women you now call heroes. And every single time, you found a way out. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the kind of weight that makes a room lean forward without realizing it. In the gallery, Sergeant Daniel Reeves' jaw tightened visibly. His prosthetic legs shifted slightly, the soft scrape against the marble loud in the stillness. Trump's fingers tapped once on the table, then went still. He adjusted his cufflinks again, this time without looking at them. His eyes stayed fixed on Jasmine, but there was a flicker, something quick and defensive, in the way he swallowed. Jasmine didn't break the gaze. The record doesn't care about spin, Mr. Trump. It doesn't care about speeches or slogans or rallies. The record is ink and dates. The record doesn't lie. The press gallery scribbled furiously. MSNBC's producer spoke into her mic. Stay on the split screen, his face and hers. Don't cut. Trump leaned in slightly, elbows on the table, and let out a low chuckle that sounded practiced but felt hollow. Old news, fake news. I've been hearing this for decades, he said, the dismissiveness forced into every syllable. Jasmine's lips barely moved. Old wounds don't heal when you keep making them bleed. The sentence landed like a scalpel finding its mark. Behind her, the veterans were still as stone. The only movement came from a man in the third row, who slowly shook his head. It wasn't anger etched on his face. It was something colder. Disappointment. Jasmine reached out, sliding the documents closer to the committee clerk, placing them face up so the cameras could capture every word. The typewritten lines, the dates, the signatures, all of it visible, undeniable. Trump's eyes darted to the papers, then back up at her. You can wave papers around all day, he said, his tone sharp but his voice lower now. But the American people know what I've done for veterans. You've done things for them, Jasmine said evenly. But you didn't do this. And sometimes what you refuse to do speaks louder than what you claim to have done. There was a beat of silence that no one dared interrupt. The marble walls seemed to drink in the tension, holding it like heat. The chairman shifted in her seat, glancing between them as though reminding herself she was still in charge of this hearing. But the truth was, she wasn't. Jasmine tapped one finger lightly on the edge of the documents. The truth doesn't need me to shout it, she said. It's already loud enough. In the gallery, Reeves's gaze stayed locked on Trump, not on the papers, not on Jasmine, on him, measuring, waiting. Trump exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound caught perfectly by the nearest microphone. His aides sat stiff beside him, their eyes fixed forward, their pens unmoving. The clock on the far wall ticked, but no one was counting time anymore. They were counting the blows. And Jasmine, calm, methodical, relentless, wasn't finished, not even close. From the second row, Sergeant Daniel Reeves rose, not because his name was called, not because protocol invited him, but because the weight in the room demanded it. The motion was unhurried yet commanding. The air shifted, like the subtle change in pressure before a storm. Conversations in the press gallery cut off mid-whisper. Even the chairman, halfway to adjusting her microphone, froze for a breath. Reeves didn't look at anyone in particular. He didn't have to. The moment he stood, the room rearranged itself around him. Light from the overhead rig caught the silver star on his chest, and for a heartbeat it flared like a flashbang. Not blinding, but unmistakable. It wasn't just a medal, it was testimony forged in sweat, grit, and blood. The soft tap of his polished black prosthetic leg hitting the marble was louder than it should have been. A second tap followed as he shifted his stance, and the rhythm was enough to make the veterans in the back row straighten in silent solidarity. Trump's eyes flicked toward the sound, an instinct he might later deny. Reeves took one step forward, then another. He moved with the precision of a soldier who has learned to measure distance and time in the same breath. The room was so quiet that the faint metallic creak of his prosthetics joint was as distinct as a camera shutter. Reporters in the front row had already stopped taking notes. Their pens hovered above paper, waiting. When Reeves reached the table, he didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the chairman. He locked eyes directly with Donald Trump, holding his gaze as if they were the only two men in the room. Then, without a word, he bent forward, his hands gripping the top of the prosthetic leg. The leather straps came loose one by one with a sharp snap of buckles. The sound echoed, crisp, surgical. A third buckle snapped open. He straightened, lifting the prosthetic free. The absence of movement in the gallery made the moment heavier. No shuffle, no cough, just the image of a man holding in his hands the price of service. And then he slammed it onto the table. The impact rang out like a judge's gavel, but heavier, final. It wasn't a call to order. It was a verdict. The metallic edge caught the light again, and the glint seemed to slice through the space between Reeves and Trump. Gasps tore through the gallery, not loud but collective, like a sudden inhale before a wave. In the control rooms of 3 different networks, producers barked the same order into headsets almost simultaneously. "Cut to that table, tight shot, now!" Trump sat back a fraction. His smirk didn't vanish completely, but it thinned, as if the skin holding it in place had stretched too far. Reeves didn't raise his voice. "I was 19, he said, the words low but unshakable, carrying to every corner of the chamber. 19 when I bled for this country." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "You were 22 when you found a way not to." It was the kind of sentence that didn't invite a rebuttal. It invited reckoning. Trump's jaw worked, his lips pressing together. His fingers tapped once against the table. Not in rhythm now, but like a man searching for something to hold on to. Jasmine sat still, her eyes locked on Trump, her hands folded neatly before her. She knew this was Reeves's moment, and she wasn't about to dilute it. In the second row, a woman with a purple heart pin leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't blink. The press gallery was silent, save for the faint hum of cameras refocusing, glass and machinery straining to capture every angle of the tableau. The war hero, the prosthetic, the former president. Reeves kept his eyes on Trump. No wavering, no glancing away. "That," he said, nodding toward the leg on the table, "is what service looks like." The sentence landed heavy, flattening whatever was left of the smirk on Trump's face. For a moment, neither man moved. The tension was its own kind of noise, thick and relentless, pressing in on everyone in the chamber. Finally, Reeves stepped back, leaving the prosthetic where it was, as if it were an exhibit entered into evidence. The space it occupied on the table became a dividing line, between those who had served and those who had avoided it, between sacrifice and self-preservation. Trump's aides shifted uneasily, their bodies broadcasting discomfort they couldn't hide. One reached for a notepad, scribbling something without looking at the words. Reeves turned slightly, nodding once to Jasmine. She returned the nod, not as thanks, but as acknowledgement. This was a battle fought in unison, even if they used different weapons. The chairman cleared her throat, but her voice caught for half a second before she spoke. "The committee will take note of the witness's statement." It was procedural, perfunctory, but in that moment, everyone knew the note being taken was far larger than any committee record. In the far corner of the gallery, a young reporter whispered to her colleague, "That's the clip. That's the one they'll run on loop tonight." Back at the table, Trump adjusted his tie, his eyes fixed on the prosthetic leg as if willing it to disappear. It didn't. It stayed there, a cold, unblinking reminder that no matter what words came next, the image was already burned into the public's mind. Jasmine glanced once more at the leg on the table, then back at Trump. Her gaze said it without words. This is only the beginning. And the room, every camera, every spectator, every silent veteran, waited to see where the next strike would land. The monitors flickered, the faint buzz of static breaking the stillness for just a breath. Then, like a curtain snapping open, they came alive in perfect split-screen symmetry. On the left, A scanned image, its paper aged to the color of weak tea. Across the top, the typed words in stark black, medical exemption. Bone spurs. The signature below, numb, looping, confident, was as much a relic of 1968 as the deferment itself. On the right, a full-color photograph from that same year. Donald Trump younger, in a crisp golf shirt. The sun lit his face in the soft gold of late afternoon. His posture was textbook perfect. Shoulders square, wrists loose, eyes locked on a white ball perched on a manicured tee. The juxtaposition was almost cruel in its clarity. Gasps rolled through the gallery. Not loud, not chaotic, but like a series of small earthquakes under each row. Tremors that traveled through the floorboards and into the bones of those who understood exactly what they were looking at. A veteran in the front row shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a hard, bloodless line. 2 seats away, a woman with silver hair and a Purple Heart pin leaned forward, her gaze narrowing on the golf photo as though it were a personal insult. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She let the images do their work. The silence became a lens in itself, forcing everyone to take in the contrast, to sit with it until it itched against their conscience. Trump glanced at the monitors only once. His eyes lingered on the golf photo for less than a second before snapping back to the table. But the cameras, merciless and unblinking, caught the microsecond of recognition, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the quick swallow. Young man playing golf while others fought in jungles. One of the reporters in the press gallery murmured into her recorder. That's your headline right there. In the control room at MSNBC, a producer's voice crackled over the headset. Hold the split screen. Let America look at it. Don't rush the cut. Back in the chamber, Jasmine finally leaned toward her microphone. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, the way someone might speak when asking a dinner guest to pass the salt. 1968, she began, a year when more than 16,000 American service members were killed in Vietnam. A year when families across this country buried sons, brothers, husbands. She didn't look at the letter as she spoke. She didn't look at the golf photo either. Her eyes stayed on Trump. And that same year, she continued, this medical exemption was granted. Not for a wound, not for a chronic illness, for bone spurs. A ripple moved through the veterans section, subtle but unmistakable. Jasmine let her gaze drift, just for a moment, to Sergeant Daniel Reeves, standing like a sentinel in the gallery. The gleam of his silver star, the absence of his leg, said more than she ever could about the distance between sacrifice and avoidance. Her eyes returned to Trump. Meanwhile, she said, the man who received that exemption was here. She gestured toward the right side of the monitor. Perfect form, perfect weather, not a speck of mud on his shoes. Trump shifted in his chair, his hand moving to adjust his tie for the 3rd time that morning. The gesture was automatic, but it was also a tell, a small tick in the armor. From the 2nd row, a veteran muttered under his breath. Too low for the mics, but loud enough for those nearby. Must have been tough out there on the fairway. Laughter didn't follow. The moment wasn't funny. Jasmine kept going. I want the record to reflect that this is not conjecture. This is not rumor. These are official records and documented photographs, both from the same year, both telling a story. The golf swing seemed to mock the words. Every slow-motion replay in the minds of the viewers at home underscored the point. One man's afternoon leisure was another man's firefight in the highlands of Quang Tri. The press gallery scribbled faster now, sensing the pivot from documentation to indictment. Trump broke his stillness, leaning forward just enough to reach the mic. It's old news, he said, voice sharper now, a little too quick. Everyone's heard it. Everyone knows it's nothing. Jasmine didn't even turn her head. Sometimes, Mr. Trump, the oldest truths are the ones that refuse to be buried. The line landed in the space between them like a weighted object. Neither moved to pick it up. The monitors stayed frozen on the split screen, the image of leisure holding its ground beside the document of exemption. The pairing needed no commentary. It was its own indictment. In the gallery, Reeves's eyes didn't leave the screen. Behind him, a row of veterans sat motionless, their silence louder than any chant or shout. Somewhere in the control room, a director called for a close-up on Trump's hands. The feed revealed them gripping the table's edge a little too tightly, the whiteness of the knuckles betraying a tension his voice hadn't yet admitted. Jasmine leaned back slightly, folding her hands in front of her. She wasn't rushing the moment. She knew this wasn't about winning a single exchange. It was about letting the truth sink deep enough that no rebuttal could dislodge it. "Mr. Trump," she said after a pause, "you've spoken often about loving this country, about respecting those who serve. But the record?" She gestured with an open palm toward the left side of the screen. "And the reality," her hand shifted toward the right side, "tell two very different stories." The split screen remained. The silence returned. And for the first time that morning, Trump didn't immediately have an answer. The ghost from 1968 was no longer content to linger in the background. It had stepped fully into the room, and it was staring him in the face. Jasmine let the weight of that split-screen moment breathe, the stillness stretching until it felt like time itself had slowed. Then, without shifting her gaze from Trump, she said evenly, "I'd like to call forward Mrs. Marcy Hill." From the gallery, a figure rose. Marcy was small in stature, but the way she held herself carried a gravity that drew every eye in the chamber. In her hands, cradled with the delicacy of someone carrying glass, was a folded American flag, the kind handed to families in hushed ceremonies, the edges pressed so sharply you could almost cut your fingers on them. She moved forward step by step, her black dress simple, unadorned, and all the more striking for it. The click of her low heels against marble echoed in the silence. Not a commanding sound like Reeves' metallic gait, but a fragile one. The sound of someone carrying a story that was too heavy to set down. When she reached the witness table, she didn't sit immediately. She stood there for a beat, the flag resting in her arms, her eyes not yet on Trump, not yet on Jasmine, fixed instead on the wood grain of the table, as though finding a place to ground herself before speaking. Jasmine's voice was soft. "Mrs. Hill, thank you for being here." Marcy nodded once and eased herself into the chair. She set the flag gently on the table before her, her fingertips lingering on the fabric as though letting go was an act she had to brace herself for. When she began speaking, her voice was low, trembling at the edges, but clear enough to carry to the furthest corner. "My husband," she said, "Staff Sergeant David Hill, was killed in Afghanistan in 2019. A pause, a breath. The tightening of her hands against the folded triangle. "He was 33 years old. We had 2 children, 9 and 12 at the time." She didn't look up. Her eyes stayed on the flag. "When they brought him home, I was told the funeral benefits we'd been promised, the ones we counted on, were gone." The word "gone" seemed to land like a stone in water. No splash, just a sinking weight that dragged the air down with it. "I had to borrow money," she continued, "to bury him. I sold his truck, the one he rebuilt himself after his second tour, to pay for the headstone." In the gallery, a man in a veteran's cap shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his cheek twitched. "My children," Marcy said, "watched me at our kitchen table, crying over numbers, trying to figure out how to honor their father when the country he served told us we were on our own." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, almost physical. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate before zooming in, as if they too understood that to intrude on this moment was to risk breaking something sacred. Trump sat motionless, but his posture had changed. His elbows were no longer casually on the armrests. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, fingers laced together. Jasmine didn't fill the space. She let it stand, let Marcy's words hang in the air like smoke that no vent could clear. Finally, Marcy lifted her head and looked directly at Trump. Her eyes were steady now, her voice finding a strength that cut clean through the chamber. "You say you support the troops," she said, "but when I needed my country most, you signed a paper that told me I was on my own." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an accusation hurled in anger. It was a statement of fact, and that made it harder to deflect. Trump blinked once, slow, but said nothing. In the second row, Sergeant Reeves's gaze didn't leave Trump's face. His hands were locked on the arms of his chair, the leather creaking under the pressure. A reporter in the press gallery whispered into her mic, "That's the moment. Right there. That's the pivot." The folded flag sat between Marcy and Trump like a third participant in the exchange, an unanswerable witness to the cost of broken promises. Jasmine leaned forward slightly but still didn't speak. This wasn't her moment to command. It was Marcy's, and she knew the power of letting silence work. In the back row, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man beside her stared hard at the floor, his fists balled in his lap. When Marcy finally looked away from Trump, it was only to place her hands back on the flag. She smoothed the edges slowly, as if restoring order to the one thing in her life that could no longer change. Trump inhaled, his lips parting as if to speak, but then he closed them again. The hesitation was brief, but in a room where every second was magnified, it spoke volumes. The chairman cleared her throat, her voice softer than usual when she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hill." Marcy nodded once, rose, and gathered the flag back into her arms. As she turned toward the gallery, she didn't look at the cameras, didn't look at the reporters, only at the veterans who gave her small nods of acknowledgement as she passed. She returned to her seat in the gallery, the flag once again pressed to her chest. Jasmine finally spoke. "The numbers we talk about in hearings like this, they're not abstractions. They have faces, names, families, futures." Her gaze swept from the veterans to Trump and back again. And when those numbers are cut from budgets, it's not just ink on paper that disappears. It's moments like these. It's the promise we made to people like Mrs. Hill and Sergeant Reeves. No one moved. No one spoke. The strike had landed, and the room knew it. Jasmine let the silence steep, like a tea bag darkening water until the bitterness was undeniable. Then, with the same slow precision she'd used all morning, she reached for a different folder. It wasn't the manila envelope. This one was heavier, the kind of thick, reinforced file you'd expect to see carried by someone with a clearance badge and an armed escort. The color alone was enough to make the press gallery straighten in their seats. A deep charcoal, its edges worn but intact, as if it had lived a long time in the shadows. She laid it flat on the desk. Didn't open it yet, just let it sit there, breathing its own quiet threat into the space between her and Trump. From the second row, Sergeant Reeves leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. The folded flag in Marcy Hill's lap seemed to grow heavier in that moment, the weight of her loss pressing against the coming reveal. Then Jasmine flipped the cover open. The first page was stamped in bold red. Declassified. The word slashed diagonally across a watermark that still read, "Top Secret" beneath it. Gasps rose from the gallery, sharper than before. This was no ordinary committee exhibit. She slid the page under the document camera. The overhead monitors flickered, then filled with the image, a Pentagon memo dated 2018. The header was crisp, the typewritten lines stark against white paper. Across the top, the subject line in all caps, "Reallocation of VA housing funds." The camera zoomed closer. A thick red line underlined a sentence that seemed to detonate in real time. Per directive from the executive office, funds designated for veteran housing and medical facilities are to be redirected toward infrastructure projects unrelated to veteran services. And in the bottom right corner, unmistakable in bold black ink, Donald J. Trump, his signature big, sharp, and final. The reaction wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was visceral. In the gallery, a Marine veteran muttered, "There it is," the way a hunter whispers when the target finally steps into view. Trump's jaw shifted. He glanced at the monitors, then back at Jasmine, his lips pressing into a thin line. His aides both leaned in at once, whispering rapidly, but he brushed them off with a small wave of his hand. Jasmine's voice cut through the air, even, steady, but edged like glass. "This isn't hearsay. This isn't rumor. This is a Pentagon memo, documenting a direct order from the executive office to strip funds from veterans and send them somewhere else entirely." The press gallery came alive, the clatter of keyboards and rapid-fire camera clicks ricocheting through the room. CNN's control room director barked, "Zoom on the signature. I want it full frame." On the monitors, Trump's name filled the screen, every flourish of ink caught in high definition. Jasmine stepped back from the microphone, letting the image linger. She wasn't going to bury the point in more words. The memo itself was the blow. The chairman leaned toward her own mic, voice quieter than usual. The committee will note for the record that this document has been verified as authentic by the Department of Defense. A few veterans shifted in their seats. One exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of pent-up disbelief. Another leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "He signed it himself. No way out of that." Trump finally spoke, leaning into his mic. "That's out of context," he said, the tone defensive but measured. "We were reallocating to projects that would benefit." Jasmine cut in, not by raising her voice but by lowering it. Luxury towers, golf resorts, private marinas. The monitors changed, without fanfare, without warning, to show glossy promotional photos of those exact projects. Gleaming buildings reaching into blue skies, immaculate greens stretching across rolling fairways, yachts lined up like pearls in turquoise water. A murmur swept the gallery. Low, dangerous, the kind that meant the veterans understood exactly what they were seeing. "This is where the money went," Jasmine said, her words paced like footsteps closing in. "Not to hospitals, not to housing, not to the men and women who served, but to those who already had more than they could ever spend." Trump's smirk was gone now. He sat rigid, eyes fixed on the images, his fingers curling against the table's edge. Sergeant Reeves' gaze was locked on him, unblinking. The folded flag in Marcy's lap shifted slightly as her arms tightened around it. In the press section, a reporter whispered, "He can't talk his way out of that. Not with pictures, not with a signature." Jasmine let the images rotate on the screen. Memo, signature, luxury projects, over and over, until the rhythm felt almost like a drum beat. She spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of the room. "This is not negligence. This is not a clerical error. This was a choice." The veterans didn't clap. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their stillness was the loudest thing in the room. Trump exhaled hard through his nose, a faint twitch pulling at the corner of his mouth. His aides scribbled on yellow legal pads, though their eyes never left the screen. The chairman leaned back, her gavel untouched. She didn't need to restore order. The order had been set, not by her, but by the evidence. Jasmine stepped away from the table, giving the cameras a clear, unbroken view of the memo on the screen. Her shadow stretched across the floor between her and Trump, connecting them in the way only a battlefield does, even when the weapons are paper and ink. No one in that chamber, not the press, not the veterans, not the millions watching from home, would forget the sight of that signature under those words. The smoking gun had fired, and the smoke was still hanging in the air. The monitors shifted again, dissolving from the Pentagon memo into a carousel of glossy, high-resolution images that looked like they belonged in a luxury travel brochure rather than a congressional hearing. First, a skyline dominated by glass and steel towers, their mirrored windows reflecting a perfect sunset over an exclusive city district. At the bottom of the frame, in bold white letters, $42 million, veteran housing funds. Then, a sweeping aerial view of an immaculate golf course, fairways manicured into emerald ribbons, sand traps carved like works of art. At the bottom, $30 million, VA medical upgrades, and then the marina, a glittering horseshoe of white yachts, their hulls so polished they gleamed like bone under the midday sun. The turquoise water surrounding them sparkled under the drone's slow pan. The caption, $18 million. Veteran rehabilitation centers. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Not the sharp, startled kind, but the deeper sound of disbelief mixing with anger. The slow inhale before a storm breaks. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stood with her hands lightly resting on the table, eyes on Trump, and said, "When you take from those who gave everything and give to those who already have everything, that's not leadership. That's betrayal." Her words settled over the room like falling ash. In the second row, Sergeant Reeves didn't blink. His silver star caught the light again, but his focus stayed fixed on the man across the table. Beside him, Marcy Hill clutched the folded flag tighter, her knuckles white against the deep blue fabric. The images continued to rotate. Towers, greens, yachts, each one paired with its damning price tag. A man in the back row muttered under his breath, "Could have built 50 shelters with that." Another veteran shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the screen. Trump leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The smirk that had carried him through much of the morning was gone now, replaced by a jaw set in something harder, tighter. His eyes flicked briefly to the monitors before snapping back to Jasmine. "You have no idea what those projects meant for the economy," he said, his voice sharp but not loud. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, the way a hawk might when it spots a movement in the grass. "The economy," she repeated, each syllable deliberate. "Tell that to the veterans sleeping under an overpass tonight. Tell it to the widow selling her husband's truck to buy a headstone. Tell it to the amputee waiting 6 months for a hospital bed." The silence that followed was surgical, a clean slice through whatever defense Trump had been reaching for. In the press gallery, pens stopped moving. Reporters leaned forward, caught between the instinct to document and the need to simply witness. The chairman didn't intervene. She sat back, eyes moving between Jasmine and Trump, her gavel untouched. She knew better than to cut into the kind of moment that history might remember. On the monitors, the images looped again. The golf course shimmered under artificial irrigation. The yachts bobbed lazily in calm waters. The towers stood like monuments to a different set of priorities. Jasmine's voice softened, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "This isn't about numbers on a budget line. This is about values, choices, priorities." She turned slightly, addressing the veterans behind her, without taking her eyes off Trump. "They paid with years, with blood, with limbs. And you," she gestured lightly toward the monitor, "paid back with fairways and penthouses." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Sergeant Reeves' prosthetic tapped once against the marble, just a shift in his posture, but the sound was enough to draw every camera in the room toward him for a split second before swinging back to the table. Trump's fingers tightened on the armrest. "I've done more for veterans than any president in history," he said, his voice gaining speed as if momentum alone could push him through. Jasmine didn't flinch. A leader's worth isn't measured by how often they say they've helped. It's measured by who they choose to help when no one's watching. The words hit harder than any raised voice could. In the gallery, a veteran with a weathered face and a Navy cap shifted forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on Trump. The line between audience and witness had blurred completely. Trump glanced toward the cameras, perhaps seeking the comfort of his usual battlefield, the lens. But what stared back at him now wasn't an arena he could control. It was a mirror reflecting the towers, the greens, the yachts, and the captions beneath them. Jasmine let the silence stretch one beat longer than was comfortable, then stepped back from the microphone. The monitors kept spinning their carousel of betrayal over and over, each image a fresh layer of indictment. No one in that room would leave without remembering what they'd seen, and everyone watching at home knew exactly what kind of choice had been made, and at whose expense. Jasmine didn't move from her spot at the table. She didn't raise a finger, didn't point at the monitors still showing yachts and penthouses. Instead, she reached for something small and unremarkable. A matte black digital recorder resting quietly on the corner of her desk. It was the size of a candy bar, the kind of object you could overlook if you didn't know what it carried. She pressed one button. A faint click sounded through the chamber speakers, followed by a burst of static. Then came the voice, Trump's voice. It was clear, unmistakable, and stripped of any podium polish or rally theatrics. "Cut the vets' budget. We'll make it up to them with a parade." The words landed like a brick dropped into still water, a deep, resonant thud that rippled outward, touching every row, every veteran, every camera. No spin, no filter, no plausible deniability. Just the sound of a man trading service for spectacle. In the veteran section, Sergeant Reeves's jaw tightened. Marcy Hill's arms instinctively pulled the folded flag closer to her chest, as if shielding it from the insult. The press gallery froze. No one typed. No one whispered. The recorders they clutched were suddenly secondary to the one playing in the room. Trump's jaw set, the muscle along his cheek ticking once. He didn't look at Jasmine, didn't look at the veterans, didn't even look at the monitors. His gaze darted briefly toward the chairman, as though searching for an interruption that wouldn't come. The recording continued, the voice on it casual, even amused. "They love that stuff. Flags, music, uniforms. Makes them forget the numbers." It was surgical in its cruelty. Not loud, not overtly angry, just dismissive. A low murmur began in the back row of the gallery. Not outrage exactly, but something colder. A muttering of men and women who had heard the truth, recognized it, and filed it away like a battle plan. Jasmine didn't stop the recording. She let the pause after those words hang heavy, the kind of silence that makes people squirm in their seats because there's nowhere to hide. Trump shifted, straightening his posture, but the move felt too sharp, too fast, like someone trying to reassert control after realizing they'd lost it. His eyes flicked toward the nearest camera, but there was no comfort there. Every lens was locked on him now, drinking in the tightness of his mouth, the stiffness in his shoulders. The chairman didn't speak. No gavel came down. The room had moved beyond parliamentary order. It was operating on something older, deeper, the instinct to watch a truth unfold. Then Trump stood, too fast. The chair legs scraped against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the air like metal on glass. Heads turned instantly. He didn't ask to be excused. He didn't give a statement. He turned for the door, his movements sharp, almost mechanical, like a man walking through invisible crossfire. Every lens followed. Photographers moved in sync, the rapid-fire shutter clicks sounding almost like distant gunfire. In the veterans section, no one shifted to block his way. They just watched, still, silent, and unyielding, as he walked the long aisle toward the exit. Jasmine remained seated. Her eyes tracked him, not with triumph, but with the calm of someone who knows the battle is already won. Marcy Hill didn't look away. The flag still clutched tight. Sergeant Reeves' prosthetic tapped once against the floor, a single metallic note in the otherwise absolute silence. Trump reached the doors, his hand gripping the polished brass handle. For a moment he paused, maybe to gather himself, maybe to wait for someone to call him back. No one did. He pushed the door open. The heavy wood swung wide, spilling bright hallway light into the chamber. And then he was gone. But the sound of his voice, those 15 words, still hung in the air, replaying in the minds of everyone present, looping endlessly in the ears of those watching at home. Cut the vets' budget. We'll make it up to them with a parade. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a confession. And confessions once heard can't be unheard. Jasmine didn't rise from her chair. She didn't follow him through those heavy oak doors. She stayed, framed between Sergeant Daniel Reeves on one side, Marcy Hill on the other, and a wall of veterans behind her, a living testament to the stakes of everything that had just unfolded. The applause started small, not the neat, polite clapping you hear at fundraisers or political rallies. This was sharper, louder. It cracked like rifle fire in the chamber, rolling forward in waves, gathering force as it moved from the veterans section to the press gallery and finally to the spectators packed along the walls. It wasn't celebration, it was defiance. Camera shutters rattled like distant drums, locking in the image. Jasmine seated at the table, back straight, head high, hands folded in front of her, the recorder still resting there like a spent weapon. Behind her, Reeves's silver star caught the light, and Marcy's folded flag was cradled tight against her chest. Jasmine didn't wait for the sound to fade. She leaned forward into the microphone, her voice steady, resonant, and stripped of anything that could be mistaken for theater. Service, she said, is sacrifice, not self-interest. The words landed hard, not because they were shouted, but because they were unflinching. She glanced toward the veterans behind her. A deliberate pause that made it clear they weren't props in her argument, but the heart of it. If you can't stand for those who stood for you, she continued, her tone sharpening with each word, you don't deserve the office you hold. The chamber didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence after those words was the kind that burns its way into memory, the kind that forces you to sit with what you've heard. The main camera stayed locked on her face, zooming in just enough to catch the glint in her eyes. Not tears, not rage, but a conviction so rooted it couldn't be shaken by any title, any threat, any storm outside those walls. For the millions watching at home, that moment didn't feel like politics. It felt like truth. In living rooms across the country, veterans sat forward in their chairs. Widows stopped what they were doing and listened. Sons and daughters of the fallen felt something tighten in their chest. Not grief this time, but recognition. In the control rooms of every major network, producers whispered to anchors, "We're staying on this. Don't cut to commercial." The feed didn't blink. Jasmine straightened, letting her words hang in the air. She didn't pile on with more accusations. She didn't try to gild the moment. She knew that in politics, as in battle, the final shot has to be clean. She gathered her papers slowly, the recorder still in place, untouched, as if leaving it there was a reminder that the truth it carried could not be stuffed back into a drawer. Reeves leaned forward, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "That's the one they'll remember." Marcy Hill didn't speak. She didn't need to. The way she looked at Jasmine, a quiet nod, a brief closing of the eyes, said everything. From somewhere deep in the gallery, a voice rang out, clear and unshaken. "That's how you stand." The words were met not with more applause, but with something heavier, more enduring. The stillness of a room that understood it had witnessed something it could never unsee. The chairman finally picked up her gavel, tapping it once, not to restore order, but to close a chapter. "This committee stands adjourned." The cameras lingered on Jasmine as the sound of footsteps filled the chamber. Some retreating, some advancing toward her. Reporters surged forward, veterans came to shake her hand, and the gallery began to empty in slow, deliberate movements. Outside, the hallway lights burned bright, waiting for her to step through the doors Trump had walked out of minutes before. She didn't rush. She stood, took one last look at the veterans in the gallery, and gave a single nod. Not of victory, but of promise. When she finally crossed the threshold, the noise outside was immediate. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. But over it all, one phrase from inside the chamber still rang clear in the minds of those who had heard it. Service is sacrifice, not self-interest. And for the first time in a long time, millions of Americans believed that someone in that building meant it. In the end, the hearing was never just about politics. It was about the quiet contract between those who serve and the nation they protect. Promises are not measured in speeches or parades, but in the lives upheld when no one is watching. If power means anything, it is the choice to stand where it's hardest, to protect those who have already paid the highest price. And in that truth, we are all called to serve, not for self, but for each other. If this story shook you, don't just move on. Hold it for a moment, share it, speak it out loud, comment, and send it to someone who knows that service and sacrifice deserve more than empty words. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where truth doesn't whisper, it stands its ground. Hit the bell, because the next chapter won't be comfortable. It's unfiltered, and it might just change how you measure leadership. This story is a fictional dramatization, inspired by real betrayals and real courage. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental, or a mirror held up for public reflection and accountability. Thank you for watching. Justice doesn't arrive by invitation. It's fought for. This is Harrison Stories.